The alarm did not ask permission. It started screaming, and I had about 3 seconds to decide whether I was the kind of man who ran, or the kind who finished what he started. My name is Daniel Ford, and 3 seconds before that alarm went off, I was the most boring person on Calder Station. I fixed relay dishes. I logged maintenance tickets. I was the human nobody looked at twice, which was exactly how every human on this station liked it. Then my console picked up a signal it should not have been able to pick up, an old frequency, a military frequency. A frequency that belonged to a fleet the entire galaxy agreed had died with Earth 6 years ago, in a single night nobody talks about anymore because there is nothing left to say. I should have shut it down. I should have logged it as interference and gone back to my coffee. Instead, I sat there with my hand frozen over the switch, listening to 4 seconds of static that resolved, for half a heartbeat, into a voice giving coordinates in a code only a handful of people in the galaxy still remembered. That was when the alarm started. Calder Station security does not knock. 3 Threll enforcers came through the relay bay door in full armor, their breathing units hissing behind gray faceplates, weapons already up. The Threll are not cruel by nature. They are efficient, which can be worse. They do not waste time threatening you. They simply assume you already understand the threat. Human technician, identify the source of the unauthorized transmission. I did the only thing that made sense. I lied. Equipment fault, I said. Dish 4 has been drifting for a week. I logged 3 tickets on it. The lead enforcer tilted his head toward my console, where the waveform of that old frequency was still bleeding across the screen, in a shape no equipment fault has ever made in the history of equipment faults. He was not going to believe me for more than another 4 seconds. I had spent 6 years learning exactly how long 4 seconds is. I hit the emergency vent release under the console with my knee, the one meant for venting toxic coolant in a fire, and the relay bay filled with white fog thick enough to swallow the room. Calder Station's automated systems are not subtle. Neither am I, when I have to be. I was moving before the enforcers finished coughing. The relay bay backs onto the station's old maintenance crawlway, a tunnel built for machines, not people, which means it is exactly tall enough for a human and exactly too short for a Threll in full armor. I have used that crawlway twice before, both times to avoid paperwork. This time I used it to avoid something with considerably higher stakes than paperwork. Behind me, I heard the enforcers shouting station-wide containment orders. Ahead of me, I heard my own heartbeat doing most of the talking. The truth is, I never stopped listening for that frequency. None of the humans on Calder Station ever really did. We told the Threll administrators we had accepted what happened to Earth. We wore the gray work uniforms they issued us. We kept our heads down and our voices quiet, because a species with no homeworld and no fleet does not get the luxury of being loud. But every human I had ever met on that station kept one private habit nobody talked about out loud. We listened to the old frequencies, every single night, just in case. 6 years of nothing had taught me to expect nothing. 4 seconds of static had just undone 6 years of expecting nothing. I came out of the crawlway into the cargo ring, breathing hard, my uniform stuck to my back with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. Cargo handlers, mostly Velcar dock workers with their long gray limbs and their permanently unimpressed expressions, barely looked up as I crossed the deck. A running human was not unusual enough to be interesting. Calder Station ran on the assumption that humans were small, harmless, and occasionally erratic, like weather. That assumption was about to become extremely useful to me. I reached the personal transport bay where station residents kept their shuttle passes, the small short-range vessels used for interstation hops, nothing built for real distance, nothing built for a real escape. I did not have a plan beyond getting off the station before security finished cross-referencing my employee file with my face. I told myself that was enough of a plan. It was not. But fear has a way of lowering your standards. The transport bay door slid open onto a scene that made the decision for me. 2 more enforcers stood at the only working shuttle, weapons drawn, clearly briefed, and clearly waiting for exactly one kind of person to show up, me. I had nowhere left to run, and I knew it, and they knew it, and for one very long second, nobody moved at all. Then the station shook. Not an alarm, not a malfunction, an impact, low and heavy, the kind that travels through a hull and into your teeth before your ears even catch up. The lights stuttered. The enforcers turned toward the bay's outer viewport on instinct, the same instinct that makes anyone look toward a sound they cannot explain. Outside the viewport, dropping out of a hard burn that should have torn its hull apart, was a ship. It did not look like anything in the Concord registry. It looked like something built by people who had run out of proper parts a long time ago, and had simply decided to keep flying anyway. Mismatched plating, a hull shape that belonged to 3 different manufacturers, stitched into one stubborn, ugly, beautiful machine. And on its flank, half scorched away but still visible, was a marking I had not seen since I was a boy, standing on a launch pad watching my father leave for a war nobody told us we were going to lose. An Earth Fleet designation. The enforcers opened fire on it. The ship did not fire back. It simply turned, presented its narrowest profile and kept coming, straight at the station, straight at us, like the pilot had already decided the outcome, and was just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. A voice came through the bay's open comm channel, rough, amused, entirely too calm for the situation. "Relay Tech, Daniel Ford. If that is you standing in that bay with 2 very nervous Threll-pointing guns at your head, I would suggest finding something to hold on to." I did not know the voice. I did not know the ship. I did not know what was about to happen to the wall behind me, the one the enforcers were standing in front of. I knew one thing, and I knew it the way you know your own name. That ship had just said mine. I did not get the chance to ask how. The ship slammed its docking clamp straight through the transport bay's outer hatch instead of waiting for a proper seal, tearing metal apart with a screech that sent both enforcers stumbling backward, arms up against the wind that came howling through the breach before the emergency shielding could even engage. Alarms I had never heard before joined the ones I already knew by heart. Calder Station had not been boarded in living memory. It was being boarded now, loudly, by a ship that did not officially exist. A figure dropped through the breach in a pressure suit scarred from a dozen old repairs, landed hard, and put 2 precise shots into the enforcers' weapons before either of them could decide which threat to aim at first. The figure's helmet turned toward me. Through the visor I could see a woman, maybe 10 years older than me, hair cropped short, an expression that suggested she had done this exact thing more times than she cared to count, and resented every single one of them a little less than the last. "You are the relay tech who keeps the old frequencies open after curfew?" she asked, like we were continuing a conversation we had already started. "That obvious. You are the only human on this station who has not deleted his listening logs in 6 years. We have been watching this station for a while, Daniel Ford. Now get behind me before the second wave of enforcers makes this a longer conversation than either of us wants." I did not need telling twice. The enforcers' reinforcements were already pouring into the cargo ring behind us, a wall of gray armor and raised weapons, and the woman in the pressure suit answered them the way I imagine soldiers always have, which is to say without much ceremony and with very precise aim. I am not a fighter. I have never claimed to be. What I am good at is staying low, staying quiet, and not being where the trouble is concentrated, and that turned out to be exactly the skill set required to get me through that breach alive. The transition from station gravity to ship gravity hit like missing a stair in the dark, and then hands were pulling me through an airlock that sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath finally being let go. The corridor beyond was narrow, dim, patched together from panels that did not match, wiring run openly along the ceiling because nobody had bothered hiding it behind a wall that was not there to begin with. It smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and something underneath that I could not place yet, but would come to know very well over the following weeks. It smelled like a ship that had been lived in for a long, long time by people who had stopped expecting comfort and started expecting only to survive the next 12 hours. "Strap in," the woman said, already moving past me toward the cockpit. "We are leaving, and Calder Station does not exactly hand out polite goodbyes." I found a jump seat bolted near the bulkhead and pulled the harness across my chest with hands that were shaking now that there was finally a half second to notice they were shaking. Through a narrow viewport I watched Calder Station fall away, its lights scattering as defense turrets tried and failed to track a ship that turned tighter and meaner than anything in their threat assessment had prepared them for. The pilot's voice came back over the ship's internal comm, the same one that had said my name through the bay channel a few minutes earlier, though now I could hear how young he actually sounded underneath the comm. "Welcome aboard," he said. "Try not to throw up on the floor. I just cleaned it." I did not laugh. I did not have it in me yet. I was still watching the only home I had known for 6 years shrink into a point of light behind us, and underneath the fear and the adrenaline, one thought kept circling back no matter how many times I tried to push it away. Someone had been listening for me as long as I had been listening for them. Somewhere out past the edge of everything the Concorde considered civilized space, the fleet the galaxy had buried alongside Earth was still flying, and for reasons I did not understand yet, it had just decided I was worth the risk of coming out of hiding to collect. The ship beneath me shuddered once, hard, as it broke into a jump corridor the Concorde's tracking grid was not supposed to know existed, and Calder Station, the enforcers, and 6 years of pretending I had accepted what the galaxy told me about my own species all disappeared behind a wall of folded space. Wherever we were going, there was no version of my life that went back to what it had been an hour ago. The jump ended with a jolt that threw me hard against my harness, and before I had even caught my breath, a different alarm was already cutting through the cabin. Sharper than the one on Calder Station, more urgent in a way I felt in my chest before I understood it in my head. "Contact," the pilot called from the cockpit, all the calm gone from his voice now. "Concorde patrol cruiser, bearing 210, and it is already turning toward us." Nora Pike, the woman who had pulled me through the breach, was out of her seat and moving before the alarm finished its first cycle. "We came out of that jump too close. Lucas, tell me you have a hole to slip through." "Working on it," Lucas answered, and from where I sat I could see the shape of him now through the open cockpit door, a young man with a sharp jaw and tired eyes, both hands moving across a console that looked half held together with patches and prayer. "Problem is their sensor net just got an upgrade since the last time we ran this corridor. I cannot find the gap. I do not know what made me speak. Maybe it was 6 years of listening to frequencies nobody else bothered with. Maybe it was simple fear looking for something useful to do with itself." "What band is their sweep running on?" Lucas glanced back at me like he had forgotten I existed. "Standard Concorde patrol sweep. Why?" "Because Calder Station ran the exact same sweep pattern on its outer perimeter, and I spent 6 years finding the dead spots in it. Patrol sweeps like that cycle in a loop. If you give me a console, I can tell you which 3 seconds in every cycle they are blind." Nora looked at Lucas. Lucas looked at me. Neither of them looked like people who had time to argue. "Second seat," Lucas said, jerking his head toward the empty chair beside him. "Talk fast." I have spent a lot of my life being the quiet, unremarkable human nobody expected anything from, and I will admit, there was something almost dizzying about sliding into that seat and watching the sweep pattern resolve in front of me, into something I actually understood. 6 years of boredom on Calder Station had taught me the rhythm of a Concorde patrol scan the way some people learn a piece of music, every beat and every silence between the beats. I called the gap 4 seconds before it opened. Lucas took us through it like he had been waiting his whole life for someone to hand him exactly that kind of opening, which, I would later learn, was not far from the truth. The patrol cruiser's sweep passed over the space where we had been a heartbeat earlier, and found nothing. Nobody on that ship cheered. I learned later that cheering after a close call was considered bad luck, the kind of thing that invited the next close call to be worse. Instead, Nora let out a breath. Lucas's shoulders dropped half an inch, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the alarm had. "Not bad, relay tech," Nora said. "I had a good teacher. 6 years of nothing better to do." That got the smallest twitch of something close to a smile out of her. And then the ship was sliding into a docking approach that finally gave me my first real look at where I had actually been taken. The Lodestar did not look like a single ship so much as an argument between a dozen ships that had eventually agreed to share a hull. Sections of gray Concorde-era plating sat welded against curved alien alloy clearly taken from a vessel that had never been built for human hands. Running lights blinked in 3 different colors because nobody had ever standardized them. It should not have been flying. It absolutely should not have been hiding from an entire galaxy's worth of sensor technology for 6 years. And yet there it was, vast and patched and stubborn, swallowing our small ship into a docking bay crowded with people in worn fleet uniforms who barely looked up from their work, because a new arrival was simply not unusual enough to interrupt whatever they were already doing. I stepped off that shuttle into a hangar bay that smelled like engine grease and recycled coffee, and into the first crowd of more than 2 human beings I had stood in front of in 6 years. Nobody stared at me. That was the strangest part. On Calder Station, every human learned to make themselves small, because being noticed was rarely good. Here, people glanced over, registered a new face, and went back to whatever they were doing, the same way you might register a new face on any street on any planet where being human was simply not remarkable. I had forgotten what that felt like. I had not realized how much weight it had been carrying until it was gone. A woman crossed the hangar deck toward us, dark hair pulled back, a uniform that fit her like she had stopped caring whether it looked sharp years ago and only cared whether it worked. She had the kind of face that made you stand up a little straighter without deciding to. "Captain," Lucas said, falling into something close to attention. "Tell me the patrol did not see you," she said. "Would not be standing here if they had. We picked up our package, and along the way he found us a gap in their sweep pattern that I did not know existed." The captain's eyes moved to me, and I felt the full weight of being studied by someone who had clearly made a habit of reading people quickly and accurately. "Daniel Ford. You have the advantage. Everyone seems to know my name except me." "Captain Grace Whitfield," she said. "Welcome to the Lodestar. I am sorry about the dramatic introduction. We do not generally have the luxury of polite ones. You could start by telling me why a fleet the entire galaxy thinks died with Earth just risked itself to drag a relay technician off a backwater station. Something passed across her face, brief, controlled, the kind of expression people wear when they have had to deliver hard news so many times that they have built a professional distance around it and still cannot quite get all the way there. Because Earth did not fall the way the galaxy was told it fell. And because the frequency you have been quietly listening to every night for 6 years was not just an old signal somebody forgot to shut off. It was a question, sent out across every dead channel we still had access to, asking whether any of our people were still listening. You are not the first to answer it. You may be the most useful. I did not understand yet what she meant by useful. I would understand within the week, and not in a way that made any of this easier. Walk with me, Grace said, already turning toward the corridor beyond the hangar. There is a great deal you do not know, and very little time to explain it properly, because we have a problem that is not going to wait for either of us to catch our breath. I followed her, because what else was there to do? 6 years of believing my homeworld was a grave I would never visit had just been overturned in the space of a single jump, and the woman walking ahead of me clearly expected me to keep up, both with her pace and with everything she was about to tell me. The corridor opened into what they called the operations deck, a wide room ringed with old display panels, salvaged from a dozen different sources, all somehow patched together into a single working system that tracked, in soft glowing red, a cluster of Concord warships gathering at the edge of a system I had never heard of. A name glowed beneath the cluster. Driscoll's Reach. That is a mining colony, Grace said, following my eyes to the display. 11,000 people, most of them human. All of them refugees from worlds the Concord cleared after the war. We have kept that colony hidden and supplied for 4 years. 3 days ago, a Concord cleanup fleet found it. Cleanup? I repeated. What does cleanup mean? It means the Concord considers an undocumented human settlement a violation worth correcting. It means they are not planning to negotiate, and it means in 4 days that fleet intends to make Driscoll's Reach disappear the same way the galaxy already believes the rest of us disappeared. The room went quiet around us, the kind of quiet that comes from people who have heard this kind of news before and have simply run out of new ways to react to it. And you brought me here for that, I said slowly. Why me? I fix relay dishes. Grace turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something underneath the captain's calm. Something closer to exhaustion than command. Because the frequency we use to find you carries an old authentication code, your father's code, Daniel. A code we have not been able to use in 6 years because the man who built it died holding the only key, and we believe that key died with him. The deck seemed to tilt under me, though nothing on the ship had actually moved. You think I have it? I think your father would not have raised a son and left him with nothing, she said. And I think we are about to find out, one way or another. Because in 4 days we either find a way through a Concord communications shield that has kept us blind to their fleet movements for years, or 11,000 people who trusted us to keep them safe are going to learn exactly how wrong that trust was. Somewhere behind me, the hangar bay alarm I had heard twice already that day sounded a third time, low and steady, the kind of alarm that did not mean danger so much as it meant attention, all hands. The kind of alarm that told an entire ship the waiting part of the day was now officially over. Grace did not flinch at it. She had clearly heard that exact alarm more times than she could count. Get some rest if you can find any, she said, already turning toward the operations deck's command station. Tomorrow, Daniel Ford, you are going to find out exactly what your father left you. And then you are going to help us decide whether 11,000 people live or die. I stood there in a room full of strangers who all somehow already knew my name, looking at a star map with a colony's name burning red at the edge of it, and understood, for the first time since the alarm had gone off on Calder Station, that running had only ever bought me time. It had not bought me an escape. There was no version of this that let me go back to fixing relay dishes and pretending I had not heard anything. I did not find rest that night, though I tried. What I found instead was a short, stocky man named Owen Park, leaning against the doorway of the small berth they had given me, holding 2 mugs of something that smelled more like engine cleaner than coffee, and clearly did not care which one I noticed first. You are the relay tech, he said. It was not a question. You are the welcoming committee? I am the man who has to figure out whether your father's old authentication code will actually open anything, or whether the captain just dragged a civilian halfway across Concord space chasing a 6-year-old rumor. Figured I would rather ask you questions over bad coffee than over a diagnostic table. I let him in, mostly because refusing felt like more energy than I had left in me. Owen talked the way some engineers do, fast and sideways, jumping from one half-finished thought to the next, and somewhere in the middle of explaining how the Lodestar's communication array had been built from the salvaged remains of 4 different navies, he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his own brother had been one of the pilots who never made it off Earth's surface during the final evacuation. He said it the way you mention weather, 2 words and then straight on to the next sentence, like stopping to explain it properly would cost more than he had to spend. I did not ask him to elaborate. I had learned that much already, in less than a day among these people. Grief here was not a story you told. It was a fact you carried and mentioned in passing, the way you might mention an old injury that still ached when it rained. Your father worked Communications Command, Owen said, steering us firmly back onto safer ground. Encryption Division, the unit that built the evacuation protocols nobody outside command ever saw. If he built you a personal code using that architecture, it is not going to look like a password. It is going to look like nothing at all, buried somewhere you would never think to check. I do not have anything like that. Everybody says that right up until they remember the one thing that never made sense. Owen set one of the mugs down in front of me anyway. Sleep on it. Or do not. Either way, the captain wants you in the operations deck at first light, because Driscoll's Reach is not getting any safer while we wait for your memory to cooperate. He left, and I sat alone in a berth that was not mine, on a ship that should not exist, turning over 6 years of small, ordinary memories looking for one that did not belong. My father had given me exactly one thing before he shipped out for the last time. A small data chip I had assumed for years was simply a recording of his voice, something private. Something I had never once let anyone else access because I could not bear the thought of someone else hearing it. I had carried it through 6 years and 2 stations and 100 searches by station security, who never once thought to check the inside lining of an old data slate I kept for sentimental reasons rather than function. I sat up so fast I nearly knocked the bad coffee off the table. By the time the ship's lights shifted toward what passed for morning aboard the Lodestar, I was already standing outside the operations deck with the slate in my hand. And Grace Whitfield was already waiting, like she had somehow known exactly when I would arrive. You found something, she said. It was not a question either. I think my father gave me his voice for a reason that had nothing to do with sentiment. For the first time since I had met her, Grace Whitfield smiled, and it was not the careful, controlled expression she had worn through everything else. It was something closer to hope, worn thin and careful, the way people hold something they are afraid of dropping. Then let us find out what 11,000 lives are worth to a dead man's last gift, she said, and led me inside. The code worked. It took 6 hours of Owen Park swearing at salvaged hardware and 1 moment, just past midnight by the ship's clock, when a wall of encrypted noise on the operations deck display split apart and resolved into clean data, and the entire room went still in a way that felt almost religious. My father's voice, the one I had kept for 6 years thinking it was nothing but a memory, had been built to do exactly one thing. Open a door that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed, straight into the Concorde's own communications shielding. For the first time in 6 years, the Lodestar could see exactly what the cleanup fleet at Driscoll's Reach was planning, in real time, down to their weapons loadouts and their attack windows. It was not good news. The Concorde fleet had scheduled their strike for the following dawn, full orbital bombardment, the kind of operation that does not leave a colony standing long enough to surrender. We had less than a day to get a fleet that had spent 6 years hiding from exactly this kind of fight into position to stop one. Grace did not waste the hour explaining the odds to me. She simply turned to the room and said the 4 words that apparently meant something very specific aboard the Lodestar. Bring the fleet home. I did not understand what those words cost until I watched the operations deck display fill, system by system, with ships emerging from 6 years of hiding. Not one fleet. 11. Scattered across dead systems and abandoned shipping lanes, painted to look like debris, like wreckage, like exactly nothing worth a second scan, and all of them now turning, together, toward a single coordinate. It was the first time since Earth's fall that humanity's entire surviving military force moved as one. I was given a seat on the operations deck for the engagement itself, not because I had earned a place there, but because the code I had carried for 6 years without knowing it was still the thread holding our intelligence picture together. And Grace wanted me close in case it needed adjusting under fire. I had never been in a real fight in my life. I had spent that life fixing dishes and listening to dead frequencies. Now I sat in a chair surrounded by people who had spent 6 years fighting a war the rest of the galaxy did not know was still being fought. And I watched the Concorde cleanup fleet's formation glow red on the display. 23 warships arranged around a colony that had 11,000 names attached to it. Drop out of jump in 3, Lucas's voice came over the comm from his fighter, somewhere in the swarm forming up off the Lodestar's flank. And for the record, Relay Tech, if your little code is wrong about their weapons range, I am going to have some thoughts about it. It is not wrong, I said, with more confidence than I had any right to feel. It was not wrong. The Lodestar and 10 other capital ships dropped out of folded space directly inside the Concorde fleet's formation, close enough that their long-range weapons, built for engagements at far greater distance, were suddenly worse than useless. It was not subtle, it was not elegant. It was the kind of move a fleet only makes when it has spent 6 years learning exactly how its enemy thinks, and has decided the only way to win is to refuse to fight the fight they expected. The operations deck erupted into a kind of organized chaos I had no context for, and instantly understood anyway, because underneath the shouted coordinates and the overlapping comm traffic was something I recognized from every relay shift I had ever worked. People doing a job they knew well, fast, under pressure, trusting each other to cover the parts they could not see themselves. Fighters away, someone called. Concorde flagship adjusting formation. They are trying to pull back to range. Do not let them. Lucas, take your wing in tight and keep them tangled. Copy that. Tangled is my specialty. I lost track of how long the battle actually lasted. Time does strange things when you are watching it happen on a display instead of living it directly. Every minute stretched thin by the gap between what you can see and what you can do about it. I watched human fighters, smaller and worse armed than anything in the Concorde fleet, fly patterns that made no sense by any tactical doctrine I had ever heard of, and somehow kept working anyway, because the Concorde pilots had spent 6 years training against an enemy that was supposed to be extinct, and had never once had to plan for one that fought like it had nothing left to lose. Then a voice cut through the comm chatter that stopped me cold. This is Shuttle Pilot Doyle, requesting immediate fighter cover. I have colonists aboard and a hull breach I cannot patch fast enough. I knew that voice. I had grown up next to that voice. I had stood at a memorial service 6 years ago and listened to people say kind, careful things about a girl I had loved since I was 14 years old, a girl the official casualty list had marked among the dead in the final hours of Earth's evacuation. Mara Doyle. I was out of my chair before I had decided to stand, hands braced against the console, staring at a comm signature that should not exist.
Daniel.
Grace's voice, close, steady, a hand on my shoulder that I did not remember her crossing the room to give me. Whoever that is, she needs cover, not an audience. We can talk about it after. She was right, and I hated that she was right, and there was no time to be anything other than grateful that someone in that room could still think clearly while I could not. I sat back down. I did my job. I fed Lucas's wing a clean intercept vector through the gap my father's code had carved into the Concorde's targeting data, and I watched 4 fighters break off and tear into the warships closing on that shuttle's position, and I did not let myself think about anything except the numbers in front of me, until the shuttle's distress signal finally cut out, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had docked safely against the Lodestar's flank. I would have 6 years of questions for Mara Doyle. None of them got asked that day. There was no time, and underneath the relief I refused to let myself feel anything else yet, because the battle was not over, and feeling things at the wrong moment, I had already learned, was a luxury this fleet rarely got to afford. The turning point came 2 hours in, when the Concorde flagship, a vast gray wedge of a ship called the Severance, according to the data my father's code had pulled, finally broke formation to make a direct run at the Lodestar itself, clearly calculating that taking out the human flagship would collapse the entire engagement. It very nearly worked. The Lodestar took 3 direct hits in under a minute, and the operations deck lurched hard enough to throw half the crew out of their seats, lights failing in long, sickly waves down both sides of the room. Somewhere below us an explosion that I felt in the floor before I heard it through the hull. Grace did not move from her station, did not raise her voice, simply kept calling adjustments into the comm like the ship beneath her had not just taken a hit that should have ended this fight in the Concorde's favor. Hull breach decks 9 through 12. Seal it, and reroute power to forward shields. Captain, if we take one more hit like that, forward shields will not hold. Then we make sure they do not get the chance. The hit that nearly ended things came 30 seconds later. A strike that tore through the relay section 2 decks below the operations room and killed every external sensor feed we had, leaving Grace blind in the middle of the most important minute of the entire engagement. The room filled with the particular kind of panic that comes from people who know exactly how bad blind is in the middle of a fight like this one. I can fix it, I said, already moving toward the door before anyone could tell me it was a terrible idea. Daniel, that section just took a direct hit. It is not stable down there. Neither is losing this fight. I did not wait for permission. Nora Pike caught up with me in the corridor, already pulling a sidearm from her hip without being asked, because apparently nobody on this ship let a relay technician run toward a damaged section alone, not even one they had known for less than 2 days. The relay section was a mess of torn paneling and emergency lighting flickering red along a corridor that groaned in ways a corridor should not groan. I found the junction by feel as much as by sight, the same kind of patchwork wiring I had spent 6 years coaxing back to life on Calder Station. Except this time the stakes were not a maintenance ticket. I cross-fed the external feed through a backup line meant for something else entirely. The kind of fix that should not have worked and absolutely would have gotten me fired on any station with a functioning safety inspector. And the operations deck sensors flickered back to life 2 decks above us at the exact moment Grace needed them most. "Feeds back," I called into my comm, hands shaking, ears ringing from an explosion somewhere close enough to feel through the floor. "Good work, relay tech," Nora said, already pulling me back toward the corridor exit. "Try not to make a habit of it. My heart cannot take this twice in 1 week." We made it back to the operations deck in time to watch the final minutes of the engagement play out across the display. And I understood, standing there with torn fingers and a ringing skull, that I had just done more in the last 10 minutes than I had done in 6 years of fixing dishes on a station that had never once asked me to be anything other than invisible. What happened next was not anything I had words for at the time, and I am not certain I have better ones now. 11 ships that had spent 6 years hiding, 6 years being told by an entire galaxy that they were a footnote in a story already finished, turned as one and answered that final Concorde run with everything they had left. It should not have worked. By every rule of the kind of warfare the Concorde had spent decades perfecting, it should not have worked. It worked anyway, because the Concorde had built their entire strategy around an enemy that was supposed to already be dead. And dead things, it turns out, do not coordinate 11 separate strike vectors with the kind of brutal, improvised precision that only comes from people who have spent 6 years with absolutely nothing left to lose. The Severance broke apart at the seams just past the colony's outer defense ring, and the remaining Concorde ships, 8 of the original 23, turned and ran rather than face what was left of a fleet the galaxy had buried without bothering to check the grave. The operations deck did not erupt into celebration. It went quiet instead, the kind of quiet that comes after holding your breath for far too long, and finally remembering how to breathe, and I understood, watching the exhausted, hollowed-out faces around me, that this was not a fleet that knew how to celebrate. 6 years of survival had worn that instinct down to something smaller and more careful. Relief, maybe. The simple fact of still being alive to feel it. I found Mara Doyle 2 hours later, in the Lodestar's makeshift medical bay, a bandage across one temple and a stubborn refusal in her eyes that told me she had argued the medics down from a longer treatment than she was willing to accept. She looked older than the girl I remembered. She looked exactly like the girl I remembered. Both of those things were true at once, and neither of us seemed to know what to do about it. "They told me you died on Calder Station 6 years ago," I said, because it was the only sentence my mind could find. "They told me the same thing about you," she said. "I stopped believing casualty lists a long time before today, Daniel. You might want to consider doing the same." I did not have an answer for that. I am not sure there was one to give. We stood there, in a medical bay full of wounded strangers and the low hum of a ship still running damage assessments after the fight of its life, and let the silence between us hold everything neither of us was ready to say out loud yet. Somewhere above us, on the operations deck, Grace Whitfield was already fielding the first transmissions from systems across Concorde space, every one of them carrying some version of the same impossible question. Was that really a human fleet? Before any of that mattered, though, there was a colony waiting to know whether its people had survived to see another dawn, and Grace gave the order to send shuttles down to Driscoll's Reach within the hour, both to deliver medical aid and to let the colonists see, with their own eyes, the ships that had stopped the bombardment scheduled to erase them. I went down on the 3rd shuttle, mostly because Mara refused to be left behind, and I had apparently decided, somewhere in the last 2 days, that I was not going to let her out of my sight again if I could help it. Driscoll's Reach was not what I expected. I had pictured something grim, a colony built entirely out of fear and scarcity, but what I found instead was a settlement carved into the rock of a mining moon, narrow streets strung with lights powered by salvaged equipment, children who had clearly been kept indoors during the battle now spilling out into open air the moment word spread that the sky was safe again. An older woman grabbed my sleeve as I stepped off the shuttle ramp, her hands rough with decades of mining work, and simply held on for a moment without saying anything at all, the way people hold on to things they are afraid might still disappear if they let go too soon. "We watched the whole thing from the surface shelters," she said eventually. 11 ships. We counted every one of them. My grandson kept saying it could not be real, that nothing was coming for us, not after everything the Concorde told us about your people. We almost did not make it in time, I said, because it felt wrong to let her believe it had been easy. Almost is not the part I am going to remember, she said, and let go of my sleeve, and went back to gathering her family the way people do after a thing has nearly taken them, and somehow has not. I carried that exchange with me back up to the lodestar, turning it over the way I had once turned over old frequencies, looking for the shape underneath it. 11,000 people had spent 4 years believing that humanity's hidden fleet was their only chance, and that fleet had spent 6 years believing the rest of the galaxy had already decided their answer for them. Both of those beliefs had just been proven wrong on the same afternoon, in the same battle, and I was beginning to understand that this single rescue was never going to be the end of anything. It was only ever going to be the beginning of a much larger reckoning, one that the entire galaxy was about to have to sit through whether it wanted to or not. The galaxy had just watched 11 ships it believed did not exist, save a colony it had already written off as collateral damage in a war it thought had ended 6 years ago. Driscoll's Reach was safe. Earth, as far as the rest of the galaxy understood it, had just risen from a grave it had been buried in without ever actually dying. The weeks that followed did not give anyone time to rest. Word of Driscoll's Reach spread faster than any of us expected, faster than the Concorde could contain, faster even than Grace's most optimistic estimates. Within 10 days, 3 more hidden colonies reached out across channels we had not used in years, some asking for help, some simply confirming that the rumors were true, that the fleet the galaxy had buried was still flying. Within 3 weeks, the Concorde stopped calling its operations against scattered human settlements cleanup, and started calling them suppression, a small change in language that told us everything about how frightened they had become. We fought 4 more engagements in that stretch, smaller than Driscoll's Reach, faster, meaner, each one teaching the Concorde a little more about an enemy they had spent 6 years assuming they would never have to fight again. I stopped being the relay tech who got pulled along for one mission and became something closer to a permanent fixture on the operations deck, learning the rhythms of fleet command the way I had once learned the rhythms of a station's sensor sweep, one pattern at a time, until the pattern started talking back. Mara flew nearly every one of those engagements. I watched her come back from each one a little more sure of her hands and a little less sure of how to talk to me about anything that was not strictly operational, and I let her set that pace, because some things cannot be rushed back into existence just because you finally have the chance. I found her one evening on the Lodestar's narrow observation deck, one of the few places on that ship quiet enough to hear your own thoughts, staring out at a starfield that did not belong to any system either of us had grown up under. She had a habit, I had learned, of running her thumb along the edge of an old pilot's badge clipped inside her flight jacket whenever something was sitting too heavy to say out loud, and she was doing it then. "You do not have to talk about Calder Station," I said, sitting down beside her without being invited, the way old friends sometimes earn the right to. "I am not asking. I know you are not." She kept her eyes on the stars. "That is sort of the problem. Everyone on this ship has stopped asking each other anything that actually matters. We ask about fuel reserves and patrol patterns and casualty counts. Nobody asks how anyone is actually doing, because the answer is always the same, and saying it out loud does not change it. How are you actually doing, Mara?" She let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh. "Tired in a way sleep does not fix. Glad you are alive in a way I have not figured out how to say without it sounding like more than I am ready for it to be." I did not push past that sentence, because pushing would have meant deciding something for both of us that neither of us had decided yet, and we had already lost 6 years to a galaxy that decided things for us without asking. "Then we will not figure it out tonight," I said. "We will just sit here instead." She did not argue with that, and we sat there a long while, 2 people who had buried each other once already, and were apparently still working out how much of that grief they were allowed to set down now that it had turned out to be premature. It was not a resolution. It did not feel like one was coming anytime soon, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like the honest version of things rather than a failure. By the 5th week, the Concorde had stopped sending cleanup fleets and started sending something else entirely. A full suppression force, built around their primary shipyard at the Meridian Gate, the choke point that controlled access to nearly a dozen systems where human refugees were known or suspected to be hiding. Admiral Edwin Holt, the closest thing the scattered human fleet had to an overall commander, called every captain still flying to a single briefing aboard the Lodestar, and for the first time since I had come aboard, I saw the full weight of what 6 years of hiding had actually cost, etched into the face of a man who had clearly spent every one of those years carrying decisions none of the rest of us would ever fully understand. If the Meridian Gate falls into a permanent suppression posture, every colony behind it gets cut off from resupply within a month, Holt said, his voice carrying the flat, worn calm of someone who had given this kind of briefing more times than anyone should have to. We do not have the numbers to win a straight engagement against the force they are building there. We have something else. We have an enemy that still does not believe we are willing to risk everything to keep that line open. So we prove them wrong, Grace said. We prove them wrong, Holt agreed, and we pray it is enough. The battle for the Meridian Gate did not look anything like Driscoll's Reach. There was no clean ambush, no single sharp strike to end it quickly. It was 3 days of grinding, overlapping engagements across half a dozen positions, fleets bleeding into each other across a stretch of space cluttered with old shipping lanes and abandoned mining platforms that both sides used for cover in turns. I spent most of those 3 days barely sleeping, coordinating intelligence across a dozen ships at once, watching the cost of this war add up in numbers I had to read off a display instead of feel directly, which somehow made each loss heavier rather than lighter. On the second day, something happened that none of us had planned for. A Corvi trade envoy, one of the neutral species that had quietly profited from staying out of every conflict the Concord had ever started, broke their decades of careful neutrality and opened their private shipping lanes to our supply convoys, cutting straight through Concord patrol routes that had been strangling our resupply lines for weeks. Nobody on the Lodestar fully understood why, not at first. We learned later that the Corvi had watched the footage from Driscoll's Reach circulate across a dozen systems and had quietly concluded that a species willing to risk annihilation rather than abandon its own people was a species worth being on the right side of, eventually, one way or another. It was not loyalty. It was calculation. It was also, in the moment we needed it most, exactly enough. The third day brought the decision I have spent every day since trying not to think about and never quite managing. Lucas led a wing of 12 fighters to hold the narrow approach corridor that the Concord's main strike force needed to clear before they could bring their heaviest ships to bear against the civilian convoy we were still evacuating through the gate. It was meant to be a 30-minute hold, just long enough for the convoy to clear, with reinforcements scheduled to relieve them well before the position became untenable. The Concord, reading our movements better than we expected, redirected a second strike group straight into that corridor 20 minutes early, cutting Lucas's wing off from any clean withdrawal. I was the one sitting at the console that had to decide where the only available reinforcement squadron went next, Lucas's wing, trapped and taking losses by the minute, or the convoy's flank, which had just opened up to exactly the kind of attack run that could turn an evacuation into a massacre. Grace looked at me, because somewhere in the last 5 weeks, without either of us quite deciding it, that call had become mine to make. Convoy's flank, I said, and the words came out steadier than I felt, which is its own kind of lie a person tells in a moment like that. Send everything we have to the flank. Lucas is on that line, Nora said, sharper than I had ever heard her. I know exactly who is on that line. I did not look away from the display, because looking away would not have changed a single number on it. If that flank breaks, we lose the convoy and Lucas's wing both. If it holds, we only lose what we are already about to lose. Nobody argued with me after that, which was somehow worse than if they had. The reinforcement squadron held the convoy's flank. 11,000 more refugees crossed safely through the gate, while Lucas's wing fought a corridor they were never meant to hold alone for as long as they ended up holding it. When the relief group finally broke through to them, 6 fighters came back out of the 12 that had gone in, and the Concord's main strike force, having spent everything trying to force that corridor, found itself caught between the Lodestar's main line and a sudden, unexpected flank attack delivered by 3 Corvi cruisers that had decided, in the middle of the battle, that neutrality was no longer a position worth holding. The Concord suppression force broke before nightfall on the third day, what was left of it retreating back through the Meridian Gate in a formation that no longer resembled a fleet so much as a crowd running from something it had badly misjudged. We had won. The gate held. The galaxy, by every measure that mattered, had just watched humanity turn a war of survival into a war it was capable of actually winning. Lucas came back from that corridor with a burn across half his jaw that would scar, and a silence that did not lift for 3 days, and I did not try to make him talk before he was ready, because I understood, more than I wanted to, exactly what I had cost him to save 11,000 strangers neither of us would ever meet by name. I did not apologize for the call. I would make the same one again, and some nights that fact sat heavier in my chest than the loss itself. I went to see Lucas on the second of those 3 silent days, mostly because I could not stand not going any longer. He was sitting up in the medical bay with a fresh dressing along one side of his jaw, staring at nothing in particular, and he did not look at me when I came in. "You sent the reinforcements to the flank," he said. It was not a question, and it was not an accusation either, just a flat statement of fact, the kind of thing a man says when he has already turned it over 100 times and arrived somewhere he is not ready to share yet. I did. 6 of my pilots did not make it back through that corridor. I know exactly how many did not make it back, Lucas. I read the names off that display before anyone told me their families. I am not going to pretend it cost less than it cost. He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of the bandage along his jaw, the way Mara traced the edge of her old badge, the small private gestures people develop when grief needs somewhere to put its hands. "I would have made the same call," he said finally. "Does not make it easier to have been on the wrong end of it." "No," I said. "It does not." We did not resolve anything that day. There was nothing to resolve, not really. Just a debt neither of us had asked to owe and neither of us knew how to pay down. And I left that medical bay understanding something about command that nobody on Calder Station had ever needed to teach me, because nobody on Calder Station had ever trusted me with a decision that mattered this much. The weight of it did not go away, it simply became something I carried alongside everything else. The way every person on that ship seemed to carry some version of the same thing, quietly, without making a show of it. Because making a show of it had stopped being a luxury this fleet could afford a long time before I ever came aboard. Owen Park found me afterward in the corridor outside the medical bay, 2 mugs of the same terrible coffee in his hands, and did not say anything at all for a while, which from Owen was its own kind of comfort. "First hard call gets the worst of you," he said eventually, handing me a mug I had not asked for. "Does not mean it gets easier. Means you get sturdier around it. There is a difference, even if it does not feel like one yet." I did not have an answer for that either, so I drank the coffee and let the silence between us do the rest of the talking, the way it seemed to do for most of the people on that ship when the things underneath were too large for words to carry properly. Across Concord space, the footage of 3 Corvi cruisers turning their guns against their own former trading partners spread faster than anything that had come before it. Other neutral species began asking quiet, careful questions about where exactly their own loyalties were supposed to sit, now that the side they had assumed was already finished had just proven, twice in 5 weeks, that it had no intention of finishing. The galaxy had stopped asking whether the human fleet was real. It had started asking what it meant that the fleet was winning. The unidentified ship dropped out of jump 4 hours after the Meridian Gate engagement ended, close enough to the lodestar that every alarm on the operations deck screamed at once. And for one long, ugly second I was certain the Concord had found a way to send a second wave before we had even finished counting the cost of the first. It was not a second wave. It was a single unarmed Concord diplomatic vessel, running full transparency protocols, every weapon system powered down and broadcasting that fact on every frequency it had, requesting, in language careful enough to have been drafted by committee, an audience with whoever currently held command of what it called the surviving Earth fleet. Grace let it dock. Admiral Holt insisted on being present for whatever came through that airlock, and somewhere in the scramble to assemble a proper reception, somebody decided that the relay technician whose father's code had cracked their communications shield should probably be in the room too, which is how I found myself standing in a formal line beside people who actually deserved to be standing there, waiting to meet the first official Concord representative to acknowledge, out loud, that humanity still existed. She introduced herself as Senior Envoy Issa Corell, a Threll diplomat with none of the armored bulk of the enforcers who had once chased me through Calder Station's crawlways, and she did not waste time on the kind of careful evasions I had expected from anyone representing the Concord Council. "The Council is divided," she said, "between those who wish to continue the suppression campaign and those who have concluded, after the Meridian Gate, that continuing it would cost more than the Council is willing to spend. I am here because the second group currently holds the larger voice, and because pretending your fleet does not exist is no longer a position any serious diplomat can defend with a straight face." "That sounds like the beginning of a negotiation," Grace said carefully. "It is the beginning of an acknowledgement," Issa Corell corrected. "Negotiation requires the Council to admit it was wrong about Earth's fate, and councils do not admit things that quickly, even when the evidence is sitting 11 ships deep in their own shipping lanes. What I can offer today is simpler, a formal cessation of suppression operations against confirmed human settlements, effective immediately, pending a full council session in 6 weeks, to determine what comes next. It was not peace. It was not justice for 6 years of being told we did not exist. It was," Grace said later, in the quiet debrief that followed, Exactly as much as anyone could have reasonably expected on the first day anybody from the Concord bothered to ask our names instead of simply deciding our fate without us. I did not say much during that meeting. I had not earned a seat at that particular table, not really, and I understood that even as Holt introduced me as the man whose father's code had made the entire campaign possible. But I watched Issa Carell's eyes when that introduction was made, watched the small, careful recalculation happen behind them, the same recalculation I had watched happen on a dozen faces since Driscoll's reach. The galaxy was no longer looking at humans as a tragedy to be filed away and forgotten. It was looking at us, the way you look at something you misjudged badly enough that misjudging it again might cost you everything. That, more than any treaty, felt like the real turning point. Admiral Holt addressed the full fleet that evening. His voice carried into every berth and corridor across 11 ships. The first time I had heard him speak to everyone at once rather than to a single room of captains. He did not promise victory. He did not promise that the cessation would hold, or that the council session in 6 weeks would go the way anyone hoped. What he offered instead was something quieter, and, I think, more useful. 6 years ago, we made a choice, he said. We let the galaxy believe we were finished, because the alternative was watching everyone we had left die, proving them right immediately. That choice cost us things I do not think any of us has fully grieved yet, and it bought us 6 years to become something the galaxy was not prepared for, when we finally chose to be seen again. I will not stand here and tell you the hardest part is over. I do not believe that, and I do not think you would believe me if I said it. What I will tell you is this. We are no longer hiding because we are afraid. We are choosing, every day from now on, how and when we are seen, and that is a different kind of survival than the one we have been living for 6 years. I intend for us to keep choosing it, together, for as long as it takes to bring every one of our people home, including the ones still standing on a world the rest of the galaxy has not yet learned to call anything other than fallen. Nobody cheered after that speech either. The fleet had learned, the hard way, that cheering invited the universe to test you again. But I watched something settle across the crew gathered in the mess hall around me. A quiet, collective straightening of shoulders that no speech about glory could ever have produced. Because Holt had not offered us glory. He had offered us the truth, carefully, the way this fleet had learned to offer everything that mattered. And the truth, it turned out, was exactly what 6 years of hiding had left us needing most. The broadcasts that followed reached further than anything the fleet had managed on its own. Independent news channels across a dozen systems picked up the recording of Issa Carell's visit, replaying it alongside older, grimmer footage from the first days after Earth's fall. The same footage that had once been used to convince an entire galaxy that humanity was a closed chapter rather than an ongoing one. Watching both versions side by side did something to public opinion that 6 years of quiet survival never could have managed alone. People who had grown up believing humans were a cautionary tale started asking, out loud, on channels the Concord could not easily silence, how a species declared extinct had just forced an entire council into an emergency session. Not every reaction was kind. Some commentators called the cessation a temporary mercy that would be reversed the moment the council found its nerve again. Some called the fleet's victories a fluke, a single lucky stretch unlikely to repeat itself. Owen Park found a particular satisfaction in reading those segments aloud in the mess hall, in the flattest voice he could manage, until even the most exhausted crew members were laughing despite themselves, because laughing at people who had spent 6 years insisting you were already dead turned out to be one of the few genuinely free pleasures left to a fleet that had not had much room for free pleasures in a very long time. Other species reached out more directly. A Velcar trade union, the same species whose dock workers had once watched me run across Calder Station's cargo ring without a second glance, sent a formal request to establish trade relations with what they now called, carefully, the Earth Remnant Fleet, an offer that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier and arrived now wrapped in language so cautious it was almost funny, as though they were worried a single wrong word might provoke the same fleet that had just broken a Concord suppression force at the Meridian Gate. Grace handled most of those exchanges herself, patient and exact, building something out of careful words that the fleet had spent 6 years building out of nothing but desperation and salvaged hull plating. I understood, watching her work through that slow, unglamorous labor, that this part of the war would never make it into the footage anyone replayed. It would not look like a battle. It would look like paperwork and patience, and the long, unremarkable work of convincing a galaxy that had buried you once not to make the same mistake twice. In the weeks that followed, more delegations came. Some were sincere. Some were clearly hedging their bets in case the war turned again, which it might still, because 6 weeks of cessation was not the same as 6 years of peace, and nobody aboard the Lodestar was foolish enough to mistake one for the other. Refugee colonies that had spent years hiding in fear began, carefully, to step into the light. Driscoll's Reach sent a formal message of thanks that Grace read aloud to the whole crew, and I watched people who had not allowed themselves to celebrate after Calder Station, or after the Meridian Gate, finally let themselves feel something closer to hope, small and careful, the way you test ice before deciding it will hold your weight. Lucas came back to active duty before the scarring on his jaw had even fully healed, because apparently sitting still was worse for him than flying, and the silence that had followed the gate slowly loosened into something closer to his old rhythm, though I noticed he never again volunteered to lead a wing without first asking, quietly, who exactly was flying with him. I did not think that change in him was a small thing. I thought it might be the most honest kind of growing up a person can do, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply shows up in the small decisions afterward. Mara found me on the observation deck again, 3 weeks after the cessation began, and this time she did not run her thumb along the edge of her old badge before she spoke. I requested a transfer to long-range reconnaissance, she said. Starts next month. It is dangerous, and it is far from here, and I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from the duty roster. Why are you telling me like it is bad news? Because the old version of me would have taken that posting without telling anyone anything, 6 years ago, and I think some part of me is still trying to figure out whether I am allowed to be a person who tells people things now, instead of just disappearing into the next assignment the way I disappeared the first time. She finally looked at me directly. I am telling you because I want you to know where I am going, not because I am asking permission. I would not have given you permission anyway, I said. I would have asked to come. I know, she said. And for the first time since Driscoll's Reach, something in her face loosened all the way into something I recognized from before either of us had a casualty list with our names on it. That is sort of why I told you first. We did not solve 6 years of grief in that conversation. I do not think 6 years of anything gets solved in a single conversation on an observation deck, no matter how good the view is. But it was a start, the kind two people build slowly, on purpose, after they have already learned the cost of losing each other once without ever saying the things that mattered. Before she left for her new posting, Mara walked with me to a part of the Lodestar I had not visited before, a narrow corridor near the lower engineering deck that the crew simply called the Wall, though there was nothing official about the name. It was exactly what it sounded like, a long stretch of bare hull plating where, over 6 years, crew members had carved or painted the names of people the fleet had lost. No ranks, no titles, just names, hundreds of them, packed close together in handwriting that ranged from careful to barely legible, each one added quietly, without ceremony, by whoever had loved that person best. Everyone adds a name eventually, Mara said, sometimes their own people, sometimes someone they only knew for a day before a battle took them. Owen added his brother's name the week I came aboard. Lucas added 6 names after the gate, one for each pilot who did not make it back through that corridor. I found a clear patch of plating near the bottom of the wall, low enough that I had to kneel, and I thought for a long moment about whose name belonged there. Not my father's, not yet, because some part of me still was not ready to write his name somewhere that made the loss permanent in a way the data slate never had. Instead, I wrote 2 words, small, in plain block letters, words that did not belong to any one person but felt true enough to earn a place on that wall anyway. Still listening. Mara did not ask me to explain it, and I did not offer to. Some things on that wall were named precisely, and some were left exactly as open as the people who wrote them needed them to be. And I had learned enough about this fleet by then to know that both kinds belonged there equally. That same week, I finally did the thing I had been avoiding since the night Owen Park handed me a mug of terrible coffee and told me to remember the one thing that never made sense. I sat alone in my berth with the old data slate that had carried my father's code for 6 years, and I played the recording all the way through for the first time, past the authentication sequence, into the section I had always assumed was nothing but a private goodbye too painful to revisit. It was a goodbye. It was also more than that. My father's voice, recorded in the last hours before the evacuation, was steady, in a way I did not remember him being steady, and toward the end of it, after the parts that were only for me, he said something I have not repeated to anyone aboard this ship, something short enough to fit in 2 sentences, the kind of thing a man says when he has run out of time to say anything longer. He told me that Earth was not falling. He told me it was only going quiet for a while, the way a person goes quiet before they decide exactly what they are going to say next, and that quiet, given enough time, was never the same thing as gone. I sat with that for a long while, in a berth on a ship that should not exist, carrying a name and a fleet and a colony's worth of gratitude I had not asked for and was slowly learning to hold anyway. Outside my small viewport, the stars did not look any different than they had 6 years ago, or 6 weeks ago, or the night I first heard a dead frequency crackle to life on Calder Station and decided, in 4 seconds, not to be the kind of man who only listened. Somewhere out past those stars, Earth was still there, quiet, waiting, not gone. And for the first time since the alarm went off in that relay bay, I let myself believe that quiet did not have to be the end of the story. It might only be the part right before the next one began.